have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order.
This is Multipolarity, charting the rise of the new multipolar world order.
Coming up this week,
3 months ago, Pierre Poilievre was going to take 50% of the total vote, an historic generational landslide. Now, here's a pub trivia question. What happened in Canada? Did it warp beneath the enormous trade gravity of the Trump Presidency? And why did Canadians think that turning to a milquetoast former central banker would turn off the US electromagnet, dismantling their country one bolt at a time?
India and Pakistan are at it again. Earlier in the week, reports were of World War III, Vishnu and Allah duking it out with nukes at the gates of hell. So far, it's all sparks and no light, but this week's rift shows how the region is both increasingly important and ever more the pawn of bigger powers.
Finally, on Saturday, foreign ministers from 5 Central Asian countries met with China's Wang to talk over deepening trade ties. It may seem like just a bunch of guys jawing over the agree-to-agree communique, but this is the dawning of the middle corridor.
But first, 51st State of Mind.
Exciting news from across the pond this week. Political extravaganza in Canada, which held a federal general election. It was won by the Liberal Party, led by Davos pin-up boy Mark Carney, was the former central banker, the former head of the central bank in Canada, and also the governor of the Bank of England in the past, and is now going to become the Prime Minister of Canada, leading the Liberal Party, which was also the party of previous Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. They won 167 seats, which was actually a gain of 2 seats from 2021. The Conservative Party, which until very recently had been in the lead and is led by Pierre Poilievre, won 145 seats, actually a loss of 2 seats. And actually, the leader, Poilievre, lost his own riding. Of course, the big story about this is the turnaround that's happened since Donald Trump was elected. In fact, the Conservative Party were comfortably in the lead for a long, long time, and they were heading, in fact, for a landslide victory if the polls were to be believed. And then 2 things happened. First of all, Justin Trudeau, who was tremendously unpopular, resigned. And secondly, Donald Trump started talking about annexing Canada to the United States voluntarily. Annexation, of course, where Canada would become 51st state. He started referring to Justin Trudeau as the governor of Canada, as if Canada was a state. This seemed to create an opportunity, really, for nationalist fervour on the Liberal side of things, rather than the more populist aligned Pierre Poilievre and the Conservative Party. It just led to a staggering turnaround in fortunes, and now we pretty much have the status quo ante again. But this is well known in the press. This is well covered elsewhere, and Multipolarity, of course, likes to offer things at a different angle. And Philip Pilkington, you indeed have a different angle to offer. You posted a really interesting Twitter thread about Canadian politics just today. And I think our listeners ought to hear it because it's an original and fascinating and I suspect correct take.
Yeah, I think maybe the reason I'm sensitive to what's actually going on in Canada is because I come from a former Commonwealth country myself. Ireland was originally part of the United Kingdom only until a few generations ago. And it actually has many of the same political dynamics as Canada, which is still part of the Commonwealth, of course. What's really stood out in the past few weeks about the election cycle in Canada, well, first of all, it's not a normal election cycle. And I think people have a lingering sense that that's the case. You just alluded to it there. The Liberals, who until very recently were associated with Justin Trudeau, who, you know, put on funny outfits and was kind of the global embodiment of woke, are now some sort of Canadian nationalist, which is the most strangest turnaround. But when you kind of scratch the surface, you begin to understand what this is. Canada historically was not really Americanized. That's what a lot of people outside of Canada don't understand today. because they meet Canadians today and you can barely tell a Canadian apart from an American. Sorry to my Canadian listeners, but that's how it is internationally. I can actually tell Canadians apart because I'm so culturally empathetic, but most people in Europe can't, and most people in the Anglo world outside of America can't, including British people. Well, that wasn't always the case. Historically, Canada had two main cultural identities. One was the Quebecois French identity, which was very, very Roman Catholic until a generation or two ago. And of course, they still speak French to this day, so the language is still there, but they've become very Americanized. They've become a strange Americanized sort of French identity. It's interesting in and of itself. Basically, via the Quebecois now are very woke, as we'd say. So they've absorbed American liberal left cultural identity. And of course, the previously British Canadians have as well. They used to be very much so of the Commonwealth. You might think of kind of more upper, the elite there would have been the same in terms of kind of an upper class quasi-British as you'd have found in Ireland. Also, you'd probably have found in Australia and so on. But they haven't been like that for a long time. The Canadians have become Americanized to the extent that, as I said, most people internationally, including native English speakers, can have a very hard time telling a Canadian apart from an American. And so Canada's in this very strange spot where it thinks it's falling back on some sort of national identity, which they're setting up in reaction to the United States. But actually, they're not doing that. They're taking part in what is in effect an American culture war. They're looking at Trump and they're seeing what every American liberal sees. The orange overlord, as I called it in my tweet. The big scary orange man. The embodiment of, whatever you want to call it, fascism, nationalism. Well, you can't use that term anymore because they're Canadian nationalists now. But you get my point. They're seeing through the lens of an American liberal. And so they're remaking their own identity in opposition to Trump by voting for a kind of this quasi-nationalist in the form of Carney, but they're just fighting the American culture war. We're seeing something very similar in Ireland right now as well, and in Britain to a certain extent, although it comes with shades of its own. But I'm just saying it's very familiar to me, so it wasn't particularly hard to understand. At a more meta level, as the global Western, I called it Anglo-liberal system on Twitter, and I think that's probably the correct term here because we're not dealing with Europe. We're dealing with the Anglo-liberal system, which is America, Britain, Canada, Ireland, the antipodes, etc., etc. As these go through the kind of collapse of the world order, what's actually emerging, and we should call a spade, are ethnic tensions. Old ethnic tensions that have been there for a very long time. This is a very similar process that we'd see in the breakup of the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia and so on. Now, look, we're not at the point where, there's a civil war or anything, and I don't think we'll get to that point. I'm not predicting that. But we are seeing the reemergence of old ethnic identities. And Canada at the moment is in this confused time where they're trying to form an oppositional ethnic identity to the United States. Right now, they're still trapped in the looking glass because they're just reflecting back American liberal cultural politics. I don't think this is going to go in a different direction. Even if the Canadians build a kind of a fake Canadian identity, as it were, out of American liberal left politics, that's fine. They can do that and they can keep that and they can call it Canadian identity. And, for all intents and purposes, it is as it exists today. But if they do that, they're setting themselves up in opposition to the United States. And that is where it gets interesting because that is only going to go in one direction. And maybe we can talk about that now because we were talking about it before the show.
Yeah, I think people don't realize that, or people perhaps realize it, but it hasn't crystallized as a thought in their minds, that the United States will not tolerate Canada or Mexico being either considerably more powerful than they are today or not towing the US line when push comes to shove. Like, Washington simply will not tolerate that. At a very basic level, the US at the moment has an awesomely powerful navy, and very powerful navies are much more expensive than powerful land armies. Like, it's not cheap to build an aircraft carrier strike group, even a single one, and properly equip it, as Britain's desperate attempts to put one strike group into the ocean have shown. It's not cheap, and it was ever thus. It's always been expensive to build navies, even back in the days when they were built out of wood and had sails. The reason that the US can afford that and afford this like really powerful expeditionary capacity where it can sail anywhere in the world and put pretty powerful land and air forces pretty much anywhere that it wants to in the world. The reason that it can do that isn't just because it has a big enough economy to do it. Like that of course is one essential component. You've got to be rich enough to do that. But there are probably a few other countries in the world who are rich enough to do that, and yet they don't, they haven't. And the reason is that the US has such quiescent borders. You know, like the US is bordered by Canada and Mexico. It's not like Germany, which is surrounded by, you know, France and Russia, or Russia, which is surrounded by Germany and Turkey and China, right? Just because the US has changed its policy, just because we've gone from this kind of liberal globalist abroad and liberal progressive at home consensus among the Washington elites to something different, a kind of inchoate and nascent Trumpism, shall we call it, that doesn't mean that China and Mexico are going to have to toe the line any less than they do now. They might not like it, but they're going to ultimately have to do it because the US simply will not tolerate them refusing to do that when push comes to shove. They get some latitude to maneuver. They can set policies to a certain degree in the same way that a member of the European Union can set fiscal policy to a certain level, but if it gets out of whack, then the big clunking fist of Brussels is going to come in and tell you to get in line, or it's going to use the ECB to remove your government, right? Like, this is how it works. And it's also how it works in North America, ultimately. It's just done under the surface. Ultimately, the US is going to force Canada to toe its line. I mean, it's one of life's ultimate political ironies that Mark Carney, of all people, the man who opposed Brexit, the globalist's globalist, the pin-up boy of Davos man and central bankers, it's such an irony that he should hold the baton for Canadian nationalism. But of course he's not holding that baton. Hello there, Andy Collingwood here, interjecting. Just to let you know that this is a premium episode of Multipolarity, the podcast. So if you want to listen to the rest of this, if you want to hear about how China is turning Central Asia into a crucial logistics hub to connect the manufacturing prowess of China's eastern seaboard with the wealth of Western Europe, if you want to hear about why the most recent flare-up in Kashmir between Pakistan and India is more important than it seems, then you should go to our Patreon page, Multipolarity, the podcast, and pay $5, pounds, or euros a month, and you'll get access. Not only that, but you'll get access to all of our back catalogue as well, so you can listen to previous premium episodes, and if you continue paying that £5 or bucks every month, you'll get all of our future premium episodes as well. Look, it's less than the cost of a pint. It'll keep you informed. It'll support this podcast. It'll help us keep it going. You can cancel anytime. But judging from the feedback we get back from emails and messages, people seem to be very much happy with it. So look us up on Multipolarity, the podcast on Patreon, and send us $5. Send us £5 and enjoy. Be ahead of the crowd. Be cool. Okay, for patrons, back to the podcast.